Welcome, and good evening. You've arrived at Secrets in Slumber, where mysteries are told not to alarm, but to soothe, unfolding slowly, like whispers carried on the night wind. Tonight, we travel into the quiet corridors of secrecy, into archives where papers rest beneath stamps of top secret and eyes only. Our story is one of the most debated, most whispered tales in the history of government secrecy, the Majestic 12 documents. They are said to reveal a hidden committee, guardians of knowledge not meant for ordinary eyes. Were they real, or were they clever forgeries meant to mislead? That is for history to decide. Tonight, our purpose is gentler. We will explore these shadows together, calmly, curiously, as you drift softly towards sleep. The desert is a place of silence. At night in New Mexico, the air cools, the wind carries dust in slow currents, and the stars seem close enough to touch. In that vast stillness, in the winter of 1984, a single man sat in a modest Albuquerque apartment, unaware that the evening would bring him into the heart of one of the strangest document mysteries of the 20th century. His name was Jaime Shandera, a researcher and filmmaker. The day had been ordinary, the hum of traffic outside, the quiet routine of home. Then came the package, anonymous, unremarkable, left in the mail like any other envelope. Yet when he lifted it, the weight of it felt different, heavier somehow, though it was small enough to fit in one hand. Inside was a plain film canister. Nothing about it suggested importance, but as Shandera developed the role, images began to emerge under the red glow of the dark room lamp. The paper took form slowly, letter by letter, word by word, like a secret reluctantly revealing itself. At first, there were only typewritten lines, uniform, mechanical, the familiar imprint of a government typewriter. But soon he saw the markings, bold, black, and unmistakable. Top secret, Majic Eyes Only. The language was clinical, the formatting exact. Paragraphs spoke of committees, of recoveries, of entities not of this world. The pages bore the names of distinguished men, scientists, admirals, intelligence chiefs, woven into a story that felt at once impossible and strangely believable. Shandera sat in silence, staring at the photographs. The apartment around him seemed to fade into stillness. Outside, the desert sky stretched endlessly, the same sky that had once witnessed rumors of a crash at Roswell, nearly 4 decades earlier. Now, here in his hands, was a document suggesting that the aftermath of that night had given rise to something far larger, a secret committee, hidden in plain sight, charged with guarding truths too disruptive to share. Disbelief was natural, forgery was possible, and yet the papers radiated the cold authority of government language, margins measured, seals stamped, terminology precise. Whether genuine or fabricated, they carried weight, they carried the burden of secrecy itself. As midnight drew closer, Shandera knew little of what lay ahead. He could not have guessed that these pages would ripple outward, sparking decades of debate, analysis, and suspicion. He only knew that his life had intersected with the shadows of history, and that, for better or worse, he now carried something that whispered of hidden worlds. Tonight we will step softly into that world. Through quiet reflection, we will walk the halls of power where these documents were said to circulate. We will meet the men whose names appeared on their pages, trace the doubts and the authenticity debates, and explore the broader idea of secrecy that endures beyond one dossier. Not as sensationalists, not as alarmists, but as quiet observers, drifting through the archives of mystery. Let the wind of the desert carry you. Let the silence of the night surround you. The story begins here, with an envelope on an ordinary day, and with the extraordinary shadows it carried into the world. Chapter 1. The Discovery in the Desert, December 1984. The nights in Albuquerque were cool, the desert air carrying a crispness that made every sound travel farther than expected. Cars on distant streets passed with muffled hums, and the faint rustle of dry leaves whispered against windowsills. Inside a quiet apartment, one man sat surrounded by the ordinary details of daily life. A stack of notes, a few unopened envelopes, the gentle hum of a desk lamp. It was the kind of scene that carried no sense of impending history. And yet, in that stillness, a single envelope changed everything. The package itself gave nothing away. It was plain without any dramatic markings, its weight ordinary to the touch. It could have contained a letter, an advertisement, even a roll of family photographs. But when Jaime Shandera slit open the flap and tipped it over, a small film canister slid into his palm. The sound it made, the soft click of plastic against his hand, was unremarkable, but the feeling it carried was heavier than its size. He turned the canister over slowly, studying it as though its surface might offer some clue. There was none, only the sense that whatever it contained had been sent with purpose, delivered without ceremony but with intent. Shandera's hands were steady as he carried it to the small dark room he kept for developing film. It was a familiar process, mixing chemicals, preparing trays, dimming the lights. The rhythm of photography had always been calming to him, a way of drawing clarity from shadows. But as the film unspooled and the images emerged, clarity gave way to something else. Under the dim red glow, words appeared, first blurred, then sharp. The letters materialized line by line until full pages were visible. He leaned closer, eyes narrowing as he made out the first markings. At the top of the page, bold and precise, "Top Secret Majic Eyes Only." The words seemed to echo in the silence. They were not casual. They belonged to a language of power, of classification, of knowledge sealed away from the public eye. He knew enough about government style to recognize the cadence, the rigid formatting, the sterile phrasing, the balance between detail and omission. These pages had been constructed not for story, but for authority. Photograph after photograph revealed more. Lists of names, descriptions of committees, references to entities not of this earth. Shandera's eyes moved carefully across the typewritten lines, the steady hum of the darkroom fan, the only sound around him. The air felt thicker now, as if the walls themselves leaned in to witness. When the last sheet hung to dry, he stood in stillness. Before him were images of documents that, if genuine, would shift the boundaries of accepted history. Yet he was alone with them, one man in a modest apartment, the desert night pressing softly against the glass. He felt the quiet weight of secrecy settle on his shoulders, heavier with every passing minute. He didn't yet know how far these papers would travel. He didn't know that debates over their authenticity would stretch across decades, that researchers would pore over fonts and signatures, that skeptics would point to inconsistencies while believers clung to the possibility of revelation. At that moment, there was only the sound of his own breathing, the desert silence, and the photographs that now hung drying like strange relics in the red light. Outside, the sky stretched wide, the stars steady in their places. The same heavens that had witnessed the rumors of Roswell in 1947 now shone over a man holding something that claimed to be its aftermath. He did not rush to conclusions. He simply stood, the pages whispering their presence, and understood that he was now part of a story that would not easily fade. The photographs that hung to dry in the dim red light of Jaime Shandera's dark room looked at first glance like any set of government documents. Black typewritten letters on pale paper, the kind of material that could have been pulled from any archive in Washington. But as his eyes lingered, details began to reveal themselves. Details that carried the unmistakable signature of classification. Each page was bordered by wide margins, the text carefully aligned, every line struck with the mechanical rhythm of a typewriter. Across the top, stamped in bold capital letters, was the phrase "Top Secret Majic Eyes Only." The ink of the stamp appeared darker, heavier than the typed text, as though pressed with deliberate force. These words did not invite curiosity. They commanded silence. The first document was framed as a briefing. The language was precise, economical, stripped of any flourish. It spoke of a committee, 12 men, selected for their positions in science, intelligence, and defense. Their task, according to the pages, was nothing less than the management of extraterrestrial biological entities and the technology recovered from unidentified crash sites. The words themselves were clinical, but the implications were vast. Names appeared, each typed with equal weight: admirals, scientists, intelligence chiefs, figures who had walked the halls of power openly, whose careers were recorded in public history books, now listed here in a context far removed from their official biographies. Shandera studied the list, tracing the names with his eyes, feeling the gulf between the known world and the one suggested by these pages. Other sheets bore formatting that felt familiar yet unsettling: numbered paragraphs, subject headings, references to appendices not included, the kind of bureaucratic scaffolding that gives a document its air of legitimacy. Even the language carried the tone of classified communication, carefully worded, avoiding excess, each phrase seemingly weighed before being set to paper. On one page, a date leapt out: November 18, 1952. The header identified it as a briefing for the President-elect of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Shandera paused, the thought settling slowly. If authentic, this meant that a president at the threshold of power had been quietly prepared for the existence of recovered craft and beings not of this earth. The possibility was staggering, and yet the typewritten words remained cold, factual, without emotion, as if describing the deployment of a new aircraft or the management of a research project. The documents included references to events already wrapped in myth: Roswell, 1947, recovery operations in the New Mexico desert, storage facilities, classified laboratories. The words gave no dramatic description, no sweeping narrative, only clipped, bureaucratic acknowledgement, as though the extraordinary had been translated into the ordinary language of reports and memoranda. Seals and markings appeared throughout, each one adding to the sense of authority: restricted distribution, eyes only. Small black symbols pressed into the corners of pages, designating levels of access and circulation. To Shandera, they seemed like echoes of voices behind locked doors, signs that these words, whatever their truth, were never meant to reach someone like him. The physicality of the documents was striking even in photographic form. The spacing between lines, the faded edges of typewriter ink, the sense of paper handled by unseen clerks decades earlier. They carried the weight of time as though they had passed quietly from office to office, drawer to drawer, before arriving here in the most unlikely way through ordinary mail to an apartment in Albuquerque. He studied them again, this time more slowly, not searching for meaning, but for detail. The rhythm of the type, the patterns of the seals, the structure of the sentences. Whatever these documents were, authentic history, elaborate hoax, or something in between, they had been built with care, and in that careful construction, they carried a power all their own. The night deepened outside, the desert air cooling further. Inside the apartment, the documents glowed faintly under the red light, their words whispering of secrets too heavy for daylight. When the last photograph dried and the darkroom light dimmed, Shandera carried the prints into the quiet of his living room. He spread them carefully across the table, arranging them in neat rows as though order might provide clarity. Yet the more he looked, the less certain he felt. Disbelief was the first companion. It was easy to imagine forgery. Anyone with a typewriter, a stamp, and a sense of drama could attempt to mimic classified style. And yet, the pages did not feel careless. They were too structured, too measured, too confident in their presentation. If these were fabrications, they were not casual. They had been built with intent. Wonder came next, quiet but insistent. If even a fraction of the words before him were genuine, it would mean that the government had carried secrets far beyond the ordinary machinery of state, not simply hidden weapons or covert operations, but knowledge of something other, something outside the boundaries of human origin. The possibility pressed against him like the desert wind rattling faintly at the window panes, and beneath both disbelief and wonder, there was unease, a sense that he now held something he was not meant to see. The documents, real or not, bore the authority of silence. They spoke in a language that demanded discretion, not curiosity. To read them was to step across an invisible threshold into a place where ordinary citizens were not meant to walk. He leaned back in his chair, the desert night pressing in around him. Outside, the city had gone quiet, street lamps glowing faintly in the distance, stars scattered across the endless sky. It was the same sky that stretched over Roswell, the same sky that had borne witness to countless rumors, lights, and unexplained moments. Shandera felt small beneath it, a single man holding pages that seemed to suggest a hidden history written just beyond reach. He did not rush to conclusions. He did not leap to certainty. Instead, he let the questions drift softly through him, as one might allow clouds to move across the night. Were these documents genuine? Were they a trap, a deception, a test, or were they something else entirely? A mirror reflecting humanity's deep hunger for secrets, for stories too large to be contained. The hours slipped away. The photographs remained spread across the table, silent companions in the lamplight. At last, he gathered them into a careful stack, placed them inside a plain folder, and set the folder aside. The weight of it lingered even when his hands were empty. Outside, the desert wind moved gently through the streets, carrying with it the same silence that had settled over his thoughts. Whatever the truth of the documents, Shandera understood one thing with certainty. His life had brushed against a mystery that would not easily fade. Chapter 2. The Eisenhower Briefing, November 1952, Washington, D.C. The air carried the crispness of late autumn, leaves gathering in quiet drifts against stone steps and iron gates. Inside the Capitol, offices glowed with lamplight, long after dusk, their corridors alive with the muted hum of typewriters and the low murmur of voices. Power was shifting. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the five-star general who had commanded armies across Europe, was preparing to step into the role of President of the United States. Transitions in government carry their own rhythm. There are folders passed from one hand to another, briefings whispered in low tones, knowledge that is less about policy and more about continuity, the secrets every administration inherits. Some are mundane codes, protocols, quiet understandings. Others are heavier, sealed within envelopes marked Eyes Only. On November 18th, 1952, one such briefing was said to have been prepared for the president-elect. Its title was simple, almost unassuming, yet heavy with implication. Briefing Document for the President-elect on the subject of unidentified aerial phenomena. The setting imagined by researchers who later studied the photographs is one of deliberate calm, a mahogany table polished smooth by decades of use, a leather chair angled toward a waiting folder, curtains drawn against the night, leaving the room lit only by the steady glow of desk lamps, and on the table within that folder, pages stamped with a classification higher than most Americans knew existed. Top Secret Majic Eyes Only. The document unfolded like any official memorandum. Paragraphs neatly numbered, sentences clipped and precise, devoid of flourish. But its subject matter was anything but ordinary. It spoke of events stretching back 5 years, beginning in the deserts of New Mexico in 1947, where military recovery operations had allegedly retrieved materials and entities not of this earth. From that moment, it claimed the United States had been engaged in a project of containment and study, a project too sensitive for Congress, too destabilizing for public knowledge. At the heart of the document was the creation of a committee, 12 men, carefully chosen, entrusted with the task of managing the extraordinary. Their names appeared in cold type, each one a figure of authority in science, intelligence, or defense. To read them on the page was to recognize men whose reputations were already public, whose service was inscribed in the history of war and peace. And yet, here they were, cast in a different role, guardians of secrets that, if revealed, might alter humanity's understanding of itself. The language was clinical, but its effect was profound. It did not describe lights in the sky as curiosities. It did not speculate. It documented. Craft recovered. Entities studied. Facilities secured. The phrasing left little room for ambiguity. It was not the language of speculation but of record, at least in appearance. For Eisenhower, if he indeed received such a briefing, the weight of command would have deepened in that moment. To lead a nation was already to bear the knowledge of nuclear arsenals, geopolitical tensions, and the machinery of Cold War secrecy. But to be told of visitors from beyond Earth, if true, would have been a burden of another order entirely. The room itself would have remained quiet. The shuffle of paper, the turning of a page, perhaps the clearing of a throat. Outside, the city moved as it always did, taxis rolling down Pennsylvania Avenue, pedestrians hurrying through the chill of November air. The ordinary life of the capital carried on, unaware of what words might have been whispered behind closed doors. And so, whether authentic or fabricated, the image remains powerful. A president-elect seated before a folder marked with stamps of highest secrecy, absorbing words that suggested humanity was not alone, and that a hidden committee had already been entrusted with the truth. The photographs of the Eisenhower Briefing document carried more than seals and stamps. They carried names, 12 of them, each typed neatly, each belonging to a man whose career was already etched into the record of 20th century America. To see them aligned together on a single page was to glimpse the architecture of hidden authority, a structure woven not from shadows, but from reputations that were, in their time, beyond question. At the top was Admiral Roscoe Hillinkoetter. He had been the first director of Central Intelligence, a man who guided the young agency through its earliest years. His presence on the list suggested continuity between intelligence gathering and the deeper currents of secrecy implied by the documents. His name carried weight, disciplined, respected, accustomed to guarding information. Beside him was Dr. Vannevar Bush, the brilliant engineer who had coordinated American scientific research during the Second World War. He was no stranger to vast undertakings kept from public eyes. Under his direction, laboratories across the country had developed radar, the atomic bomb, and countless technologies that reshaped warfare. If one were to imagine a civilian scientist entrusted with knowledge beyond the ordinary, Bush would have seemed inevitable. The list continued. General Nathan Twining, head of the Air Materiel Command, whose signature once declared that the phenomenon is something real, not visionary or fictitious. Rear Admiral Sidney Sowers, the nation's first director of Central Intelligence Group before the CIA was even formally born. General Hoyt Vandenberg, Air Force Chief of Staff, his name already tied to classified aerial investigations. Each man brought something distinct: military command, scientific genius, bureaucratic precision, intelligence oversight. Publicly, they had shaped the nation's defenses and innovations, but here, in the margins of these documents, they were presented as something more, custodians of knowledge that reached beyond ordinary statecraft. The style of the document was steady, almost indifferent, as it laid out their charge. The 12 were said to be responsible for coordinating recovery efforts of unidentified aerial craft, analyzing material of unknown origin, and overseeing the study of entities referred to only as extraterrestrial biological. The phrasing was clinical, avoiding description, as if the less said, the more weight the words carried. There was no flourish, no narrative, only the suggestion of meetings held in quiet rooms, of files circulated hand to hand, of decisions made by men accustomed to balancing the burdens of war and secrecy. Their biographies were real, their service undeniable. To connect them now to this alleged committee was to place familiar faces into unfamiliar roles, a dissonance that left readers both unsettled and captivated. The power of such a list did not lie only in the names themselves, but in their plausibility. Each man had already lived within worlds the public only glimpsed in fragments. For them to extend into another layer of secrecy seemed believable, perhaps too believable, perhaps deliberately so. As Shandera studied those names on the film, he must have felt the strangeness of holding reputations in his hands, men long gone, but now reappearing as ghosts of authority in photographs of typewritten pages. They were neither myth nor fiction. They were historical figures whose legacies gave the documents their aura of reality. The apartment was still, the desert night pressing gently against the walls. On his table lay 12 names, 12 lives already entwined with secrecy, now bound together in a story that reached beyond Earth itself. Whether true or not, the power of the list was undeniable. It carried the voice of authority, calm and steady, whispering from the margins of history. The briefing did not linger on story. It did not dramatize, did not embellish, and yet within its clipped paragraphs, one thread returned again and again. Roswell, July 1947. The New Mexico desert, hot and restless beneath summer skies. The town of Roswell had been quiet then, its life moving to the rhythm of cattle drives and small-town rituals. But outside its limits, on remote ranch land, debris was discovered. Metallic fragments, beams with strange markings, material that resisted ordinary explanation. What followed became one of the most argued episodes in American memory. The Army first announced they had recovered a flying disc, then quickly revised their statement to a weather balloon. The briefing for Eisenhower framed the event differently. It described recovery operations, not rumors, teams dispatched under military command, materials secured, biological entities mentioned, though never detailed, only referred to in cold bureaucratic shorthand. The tone was factual, the sentences sparse, as if the writers were not describing something extraordinary, but recording another logistical exercise. Reading it, one could imagine a convoy crossing desert roads at night, trucks moving slowly, headlights dimmed, soldiers quiet as they gathered fragments of something unearthly, storage facilities accepting crates marked with numbers only a few would ever understand, laboratories sealed against intrusion, their work hidden behind locked doors and layers of clearance. The words themselves offered no such imagery, but they carried its shadow. For Eisenhower, if this document was ever placed before him, Roswell would not have been a rumor. It would have been a classified origin story, the point where secrecy began, and where the machinery of institutional silence first turned its wheels. From that night in 1947, the briefing suggested the United States had been engaged in more than national defense. It had been engaged in containment, not of enemies, but of knowledge too vast for public sight. The Committee of 12, Majestic 12, was presented as the outcome of that containment. Their charge was not only to manage material, but to manage narrative, to keep the extraordinary bound within the language of the ordinary, to translate craft into aerial phenomena, beings into biological entities, wonder into memoranda. Shandera, sitting at his table decades later, would have read those words with a quiet unease. Roswell had always been the whisper behind every UFO story, the spark that refused to die. To see it here, stamped into typewritten lines with the authority of classification, gave the myth a new weight. It made the legend official, if only on paper. Outside his apartment, the desert lay unchanged. The same night winds moved through the same sagebrush, the same stars shone over the horizon, and perhaps that was the strangest truth of all the land remembered, even when the files did not. Chapter 3. The 12 Guardians. The list of 12 men in the Majestic 12 documents read like a roll call of mid-century authority. These were not names borrowed from fiction, nor anonymous placeholders. They were figures whose careers stood in the light of public record, whose influence shaped science, defense, and intelligence in the decades that followed the Second World War. And yet, in these pages, they appeared differently, not as builders of nations, but as custodians of secrets. Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter was first. His service was unquestioned. A graduate of the Naval Academy, a veteran of war, he became the first Director of Central Intelligence in 1947, the very year Roswell entered the lexicon of rumor. To see his name attached to a committee dealing with unexplained aerial craft felt plausible. He was a man used to silence, to keeping knowledge compartmentalized, to drawing boundaries around what the public could and could not know. Next came Dr. Vannevar Bush. Few civilians had ever carried such influence during wartime. As head of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, he orchestrated the Manhattan Project, radar development, and countless other breakthroughs that turned the tide of global conflict. His gift was not simply invention, but coordination, linking universities, laboratories, and government agencies into a web of innovation hidden from the public until its results altered history. In that light, his presence on a secret committee managing technologies not of this world felt eerily consistent. General Nathan Twining's name followed. As head of the Air Materiel Command and later chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he had already made his own mark in the official record of UFO history. In 1947, in a memorandum that would later surface, he declared the phenomenon reported is something real and not visionary or fictitious. That single sentence, calm and official, lent his alleged involvement with Majestic 12 a resonance that was hard to ignore. There was General Hoyt Vandenberg, who rose to become Air Force Chief of Staff, remembered for his careful stewardship of intelligence during the early Cold War, and Admiral Sidney Sowers, who served briefly, but importantly, as the first director of Central Intelligence Group, the organization that predated the CIA. Both men had lived in the margins of secrecy, accustomed to carrying knowledge between classified corridors. The list also included Dr. Donald Menzel, the Harvard astronomer. His public reputation was of skepticism, a man who dismissed flying saucer reports as misinterpretations and fantasy. To see his name among the 12 raised questions, was he placed there as a disinformer, a man whose public doubt masked private knowledge, or was his inclusion a flaw of forgery, an odd choice by whoever had typed the list? Others rounded out the roster: Robert Cutler, aide to the president; James Forrestal, the first Secretary of Defense; Dr. Detlef Bronk, an authority on aviation medicine; Dr. Jerome Hunziker, an MIT engineer; and General Robert Montague, who oversaw missile development in New Mexico. Each name linked back to genuine service, genuine authority, genuine influence. Together they formed a picture of a committee that could plausibly exist: men drawn from science, the military, and government, a balance of disciplines, a convergence of power. To imagine them gathered around a table in a secure room, papers spread before them, was not difficult. Their careers had already placed them in countless such meetings. This perhaps was simply another, hidden more deeply than the rest. For Shandera, staring at the names on film, the weight of history pressed heavily. These were not strangers. They were the architects of the world he lived in, the men who had built the post-war order. To see them described as guardians of unearthly secrets blurred the line between fact and myth, and in that blur, the mystery deepened. To imagine 12 men sitting in secrecy is to imagine not a single gathering, but a system, an architecture of compartments, corridors, and layers designed to shield knowledge from all but a select few. The Majestic 12 documents, whether genuine or forged, suggested such a structure, and the more one studies the patterns of classified work in mid-century America, the easier it becomes to see how it might have functioned. Secrecy in government is never total, but it is precise. Those within it learn to handle information like a living substance, contained within channels, guided carefully from one point to another. The words "need to know" are more than a phrase. They are the foundation. A man might have the highest clearance in the nation, but unless his duties require a fragment of knowledge, that fragment remains hidden. Even among colleagues, silence is the default. If Majestic 12 existed, its members would not have needed to know every detail themselves. Instead, they would act as a nexus. One would oversee military recovery operations. Another would liaise with laboratories. A scientist might handle reports of biological material, while an admiral managed the movement of hardware. Each held a piece, but not the whole. The whole existed only in their shared presence, when fragments were quietly aligned. Documents, if circulated, would have been marked with the highest classifications, routed through trusted couriers, stored in safes within safes. Memos might be stripped of context, leaving only the bare essentials for the recipient. Meetings, if they occurred, would be rare and brief, held in secure rooms far from windows, far from casual ears. Their existence itself would not be acknowledged outside the circle. Even those tasked with implementing decisions might never have known who had given the order. A technician at a base might be told to transport a sealed container without knowing who had authorized the move or what the container held. A scientist might be handed fragments of unknown alloy, asked to test tensile strength without being told where it came from. In this way, thousands could participate in a project without any but a handful understanding its true scope. This is the architecture of plausible deniability. When questions arise, officials can truthfully say they know nothing of the matter. For most, that answer is genuine. For the few who know more, the silence is heavier. They carry the burden alone, aware that even their colleagues cannot share it. Such systems leave traces, files mislabeled or locked in obscure archives, budget lines hidden within larger programs, facilities whose purpose is clear to a few and invisible to the many. A committee like Majestic 12 would not need to leave minutes of its meetings. Its presence would exist in decisions carried out, in directives spoken softly, in policies that seemed to emerge from nowhere, yet carried the weight of authority. For Shandera, holding those photographed pages, the idea of such a committee was not impossible. History already offered precedents. The Manhattan Project had spanned multiple states and thousands of people, yet remained hidden from public view until the atomic bomb fell. Programs like Ultra during the Second World War, or later MK Ultra, had survived through silence and compartmentalization. Against that backdrop, the notion of 12 men meeting in secrecy to manage an extraordinary phenomenon did not feel implausible. And yet, in that plausibility lay the mystery. Was Majestic 12 a revelation, or was it a fabrication designed to feel real precisely because it mirrored the habits of genuine secrecy? Shandera could not know. He could only study the pages, sense their measured authority, and imagine the corridors where such a committee might once have walked. If the committee described in the documents had ever existed, its members would not have been chosen for their brilliance alone. They would have been chosen for their ability to carry weight. For secrecy, after all, is not only an act of withholding, it is a burden, measured in years and heavy in silence. To sit in such a circle would have meant nights that stretched long past midnight, rooms where voices dropped to whispers, though no outsider was near. Imagine a small conference room deep inside a government building, the air faint with the scent of old paper and polished wood. 12 men gathered, each with a folder, each folder marked with stamps no secretary could casually handle. The clock on the wall ticking softly. Outside, the hum of ordinary life continued, but inside, the conversation revolved around questions that could never be spoken aloud beyond those walls. What do you do with wreckage that resists all attempts at replication? What do you do with reports of entities that do not fit the catalog of earthly life? To share would be to risk panic. To suppress would be to risk history, forgetting what was found. To study would be to invite the impossible into laboratories unprepared for it. Every choice carried its own kind of danger. Perhaps they debated with steady voices, each man offering his expertise. The scientist describing the properties of unusual alloys, the general outlining recovery operations in deserts and mountains, the intelligence chief warning of disinformation campaigns, of Soviet eyes watching for every slip. In such meetings, decisions would be made not only about what was known, but about what would never be said. There is a loneliness in that role. A soldier can share war stories, a scientist can publish findings, an intelligence officer can retire with memoirs redacted, but still intact. But the members of such a committee, if it existed, would have carried secrets with no outlet, not to family, not to colleagues, not even to the history books. The silence itself became their legacy. For Shandera, staring at those names, this was perhaps the most haunting thought. These were men who had walked proudly in daylight, delivering speeches, attending ceremonies, appearing in photographs beside presidents. Yet, according to these pages, they had also walked quietly in night corridors, signing memos that would never see the public record, carrying truths that could not be spoken. The contrast was sharp: public lives full of recognition, private lives shadowed by knowledge too strange to share. The documents offered no glimpse of how these men felt. They recorded no doubts, no fears, no questions whispered after the meetings ended. But one can imagine the weight pressing on their shoulders as they returned home late at night, loosening ties, staring for a long moment at silent windows before turning out the lights. If the Majestic 12 Committee truly existed, their greatest achievement may not have been managing secrets. It may have been carrying them at all, holding the unbearable in silence, and leaving behind only fragments on paper for others, decades later, to find in the quiet of a desert night. Chapter 4: Authenticity and Doubt. The Majestic 12 documents did not remain confined to the quiet of one Albuquerque apartment. As copies began to circulate, researchers, historians, and skeptics turned their attention to them with the same intensity one might devote to fragile artifacts unearthed from an ancient site. To hold a page stamped "Top Secret, Majic Eyes Only" was to feel the pull of mystery. But for those trained in careful analysis, the question was never what the words claimed. The question was whether the paper itself could stand as evidence. Document analysis begins with the surface, the font, the spacing, the alignment of margins. Every government office has its habits, its formatting conventions, its invisible fingerprints. A report written in 1947 carries subtle differences from one drafted in 1952, the rhythm of typing, the choice of phrasing, the way a date is positioned at the top of a page. To the untrained eye, such details are invisible. To the analyst, they are the seams through which truth or fabrication may reveal itself. The Majestic 12 papers were studied under magnification. Experts examined the way the typewriter struck the paper, the slight variations in ink distribution, the spacing between letters. Were they consistent with machines available in the early 1950s? Did the abbreviations match official styles of the era? Even the simplest detail, whether a period followed US or not, could be a clue. Paper itself became part of the investigation. Fibers were studied, aging patterns observed. Genuine government documents from the 1940s and 1950s were compared side by side. Some researchers claimed the paper looked too fresh, too clean for something allegedly 3 decades old. Others argued the opposite, that nothing stood out as overtly wrong, that it was precisely the ordinariness of the material that lent credibility. Then there were the signatures. Names like Truman and Eisenhower appeared in careful reproductions, lending authority at a glance. But handwriting analysts slowed the eye, studying stroke by stroke, curve by curve. They asked whether the signatures were genuine or traced, whether they matched verified samples or carried subtle distortions. To believers, the signatures tied the documents directly to the highest offices in the land. To skeptics, they were the most suspicious detail of all. Beyond the physical evidence lay the cadence of the language. Bureaucratic prose has its own rhythm, its own understated music. Those who had worked in archives knew the tone well. Cautious, precise, neither too detailed nor too vague. The Majestic 12 papers mirrored that style almost perfectly, as though whoever wrote them had studied the language of classification with care. To some, this was evidence of authenticity. To others, it was evidence of a skilled forgery, written by someone who understood how official words were meant to sound. The deeper the analysts looked, the less clarity they found. For every point of consistency, a contradiction emerged. For every detail that suggested genuineness, another raised suspicion. It was as though the documents had been designed to hover permanently in that liminal space, too authentic to dismiss outright, too flawed to fully embrace. In this way, the papers became more than their contents. They became puzzles of ink and fiber, case studies in the archaeology of secrecy. They asked the same question again and again: can paper alone prove the weight of history, or does it merely carry the echoes of what we wish to find? And so the study continued, calm and patient, under magnifying glasses and fluorescent lights. Each letter was weighed, each margin measured, as if the truth might emerge from the quiet details of type and texture. The longer researchers lingered over the Majestic 12 papers, the more the cracks began to appear. What had seemed at first like seamless authority slowly revealed inconsistencies, small but persistent, like threads pulling loose from a tightly woven cloth. One of the first anomalies lay in formatting. Government documents, especially those marked at the highest levels of secrecy, follow rigid patterns. Headers, footers, and classification markings are placed with precision. Yet, in the Majestic 12 briefing, the placement of certain stamps seemed off, shifted slightly, inconsistent between pages. On one, the phrase "top secret, Majic Eyes Only" hovered lower than expected. On another, the spacing varied subtly from the standards of the era. To a casual reader, such details were invisible. To archivists, they raised quiet suspicion. Then there was the question of terminology. Certain phrases, while official sounding, did not appear in documents of the 1940s or early 1950s. Critics pointed out that the use of unidentified aerial phenomena, for example, was rare in the period. The more common phrasing then was flying disc or unidentified object. To skeptics, the language suggested hindsight, words chosen not in their own time, but in reflection decades later, as though someone writing in the 1980s were attempting to sound like the 1950s. Dates and signatures provided further friction. The Truman signature on one memo looked correct at a glance, but when compared to authenticated examples, analysts noticed irregularities. Certain pen strokes were too even, lacking the natural variation of hurried handwriting. Some experts suggested it had been traced, carefully imitated by hand or machine. To believers, the signature was proof of presidential involvement. To skeptics, it was a flaw too large to ignore. Even the names on the list carried contradictions. Men like Vannevar Bush and Roscoe Hillenkoetter certainly held the influence implied by the documents, but others, such as Donald Menzel, known publicly as a fierce skeptic of UFOs, seemed strangely chosen. Why would a man who spent his life dismissing reports of flying saucers be secretly part of a committee dedicated to their study? Was it irony, disinformation, or simply the mistake of a forger unfamiliar with the personalities involved? The cumulative effect of these questions was not a clear verdict, but a mounting unease. Each inconsistency alone might be explained away. Together they suggested intention. The documents felt almost too perfect in some respects, too flawed in others. They occupied a middle ground that left both believers and skeptics unsatisfied, unable to close the file with certainty. For Shandera, and for the small circle of researchers who first handled the papers, the inconsistencies carried their own kind of weight. If the documents were forgeries, they were remarkably elaborate, crafted with enough care to spark decades of debate, yet seeded with enough flaws to remain perpetually unresolved. If they were genuine, then perhaps the imperfections were simply human. The small mistakes of clerks and typists working late into the night on matters that history was never meant to see. The debate unfolded slowly in articles, letters, and conferences. Some voices leaned toward authenticity, pointing to the authority of the names, the plausibility of the structures described. Others dismantled the documents line by line, declaring them clever fabrications. And still, between the two poles, the documents themselves sat quietly, their words unchanged, their mystery intact. In this way, the flaws became part of the legend. They ensured the papers would never be fully embraced, nor fully dismissed. They remained suspended in that uneasy space, forever provoking questions, never offering resolution. In the end, perhaps the most telling detail about the Majestic 12 documents was not the ink or the paper, the spacing or the signatures. It was the people who encountered them, and the very different ways they chose to respond. For believers, the very act of denial was proof. They pointed out that when government agencies were asked about the papers, the answers were cautious and dismissive, but never conclusive. Files could not be located, signatures could not be verified, names could not be explained away. To those inclined toward trust in the extraordinary, such absence was not weakness, but strength. The lack of confirmation became a kind of confirmation itself, a silence louder than words. For skeptics, the story was reversed. The flaws were enough. The inconsistent formatting, the suspect language, the shaky signatures, all of these pointed toward forgery. They argued that a truly classified briefing, prepared for a president-elect, would never have carried such obvious mistakes. The weight of Cold War bureaucracy left no room for sloppiness. To their eyes, the documents were clever, but hollow, crafted to tempt belief, without ever delivering proof. Between these two poles stood the quiet psychology of longing. Human beings, after all, are drawn to stories that stretch beyond the ordinary. The stars at night whisper of possibility. The silence of deserts and forests invites speculation. And when a set of papers appears stamped with the highest classifications, it offers something irresistible, the chance that behind locked doors, someone else already knows the answers we yearn for. For those who believed, the documents carried comfort. They suggested that humanity was not alone, that our leaders had already acknowledged the truth of visitors from beyond. For those who doubted, the comfort was different, but no less real. To dismiss the documents was to keep the world intact, to preserve the boundaries of the known. Both positions eased a kind of existential tension. Both served as a way of making sense of the vast unknown. The conversations rarely converged. conferences filled with quiet debates, journals carried articles dissecting margins and typefaces, yet the heart of the matter remained elusive. The papers themselves seemed to exist in a liminal space, refusing to resolve, refusing to settle into clarity, and perhaps that was their power. Whether forged or genuine, they had become mirrors, reflecting the hopes and fears of those who studied them. To some, they were a glimpse of cosmic truth, withheld by governments yet preserved in whispers. To others, they were cautionary tales, reminders of how easily human longing can be manipulated by carefully placed words and seals. For Shandera, alone with the photographs on that first night, the burden was simpler. He did not yet know how the world would argue over them. He only knew that he held something heavy, something that pulled at the imagination, something that blurred the line between reality and myth. That feeling, more than anything printed on the page, was what endured. Chapter 5. The Shadow Government Concept. Beyond the mystery of the Majestic 12 papers lies an older, deeper question, one not confined to UFOs or hidden committees, but to the very structure of power itself. How much of government rests in the daylight of elections and speeches, and how much exists in corridors where the public cannot see? The term shadow government has carried many meanings. In political science, it sometimes refers to the opposition parties that prepare to govern should power change hands. But in the language of secrecy, it means something different, an unelected framework, operating quietly alongside official structures, guiding decisions that rarely appear in newspapers or public records. The Majestic 12 story, whether genuine or fabricated, resonated because it fit into this broader tradition. The belief that behind presidents and parliaments lie committees, programs, and systems invisible to ordinary citizens. The 20th century was fertile ground for such ideas. Wartime secrecy had proven not only possible, but essential. Entire programs existed for years without the public knowing, shielded by classification, their results unveiled only when the moment required. The Manhattan Project is perhaps the clearest example. For nearly 4 years, tens of thousands of people labored across multiple states and nations to produce the atomic bomb. Towns were built, laboratories thrived, raw materials were mined and refined, all without the full awareness of those outside the circle. When Hiroshima was struck, the public learned in a single moment what had been hidden in plain sight. This was not conspiracy, but design. Secrecy was not an accident of war, but its instrument. And when the war ended, secrecy did not dissolve. The networks of scientists, military leaders, and administrators who had built wartime projects found themselves embedded in the machinery of government. The Cold War demanded their skills again, not only for weapons, but for surveillance, intelligence, and technology. In this environment, the line between official policy and shadow structure blurred. It is here that the Majestic 12 papers, authentic or not, found their resonance. They suggested continuity, that just as the Manhattan Project had been hidden to guard the future of war, so too might another committee have been hidden to guard something far stranger. The public did not need to stretch far to imagine such a pattern. It was already familiar. Consider the military, industrial complex, a phrase President Eisenhower himself used in his farewell address of 1961. He warned of the growing influence of a permanent armament industry, bound tightly to government, its decisions hidden in contracts and laboratories rather than ballot boxes. His words carried caution, but also recognition. Structures once born in secrecy could outlive their original purpose, becoming part of the foundation of power. the architecture of a shadow government does not require malice. It requires momentum. Once secrets are kept, they tend to remain so. Once committees are formed, they linger. Once facilities are built, their walls remember what they were designed to contain. The Majestic 12 story, then, is not startling because it is unique. It is startling because it feels like an extension of patterns already proven true. For those who studied the documents, this was part of their quiet power. Whether real or forged, they tapped into the unease many already carried, that history is shaped as much by what is hidden as by what is revealed. The names on the list felt plausible because the machinery of secrecy was already known. The idea of 12 guardians in shadow felt less like fantasy and more like a continuation of a system that had begun long before 1947 and has never truly ended. When skeptics dismissed the Majestic 12 papers as forgery, believers often pointed not to the documents themselves, but to history. They reminded us that some of the most extraordinary government programs of the 20th century had remained concealed for years, even decades, before the public ever learned their names. If vast projects could be hidden once, why not again? The Manhattan Project is the most enduring example. In the early 1940s, entire cities were constructed for the sole purpose of building a weapon beyond imagination. Oak Ridge in Tennessee, Los Alamos in New Mexico, Hanford in Washington, all were carved from wilderness into thriving, secret towns. Thousands of workers rose each morning, took up their tasks, and returned each evening without ever being told what their labor produced. Only a handful of scientists and generals knew the full scope. The rest worked in fragments, believing they were contributing to research of limited importance. In truth, they were building the bomb that would end a war. For nearly 4 years, this immense program remained hidden from public view, costing billions of dollars and involving tens of thousands of people. When the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world saw not only the devastation of nuclear power, but the staggering capacity of secrecy. If an entire city could be built in silence, was it so impossible to imagine a committee of 12 meeting quietly in secure rooms? Later, other examples would surface. MK Ultra, a program of the Central Intelligence Agency, ran for nearly 2 decades before it was exposed in the 1970s. Under its banner, researchers tested psychoactive drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and psychological manipulation, often without the knowledge or consent of the subjects involved. Hospitals, prisons, and universities became quiet laboratories for experiments that would not see daylight until long after they ended. To read the files today is to confront not only the experiments themselves, but the fact that they were hidden for so long, existing in the margins of government budgets and compartmentalized memos. Then there was COINTELPRO, the FBI's counterintelligence program aimed at surveilling and disrupting political groups deemed subversive. From the late 1950s through the 1970s, its activities ranged from wiretaps to infiltration, harassment, and disinformation campaigns. It remained secret until stolen files revealed its scope in 1971. What shocked the public was not only the tactics, but the invisibility, an entire program operating in the shadows of official policy, shaping events without acknowledgement. These are only a few examples, but they illustrate the same pattern. Real programs of immense scope, hidden for years, revealed only by chance, investigation, or confession. Each case reinforced a quiet truth: governments are capable of secrecy far greater than most citizens imagine. Against this backdrop, the Majestic 12 documents took on a different resonance. Even if they were flawed, Even if they carried inconsistencies, they tapped into the memory of these hidden histories. The public knew now that entire laboratories, entire towns, entire decades of classified activity could exist unseen. The suggestion that a small group might have been tasked with managing extraordinary recoveries no longer felt wholly implausible. For Shandera and the few who first studied the papers, the comparison was natural. The Manhattan Project had remained hidden until the moment of use. MK Ultra had remained hidden until congressional inquiries forced disclosure. COINTELPRO had remained hidden until chance intervened. Perhaps, they thought, Majestic 12 remained hidden still, glimpsed only through the thin crack of a leaked film canister. Whether genuine or forged, the documents thrived in that atmosphere of precedent. They asked a question history itself had already answered many times. If the extraordinary can be hidden once, why not again? Secrecy, once created, rarely fades. It carries a kind of momentum, gathering weight as years pass until silence itself becomes the tradition. The Majestic 12 documents, whether true or forged, hinted at this reality, not only of secrets kept, but of secrets that become permanent fixtures in the machinery of government. Classification is meant to be temporary. Every page marked confidential or top secret is, in theory, scheduled for review. Files are supposed to be examined, declassified when risk has passed, released into the stream of history where they belong. But the habit of secrecy resists surrender. Once a file is sealed, it is easier to keep it sealed. The impulse to release competes against the impulse to protect, and often protection wins. Archivists who spend their lives inside federal buildings describe basements filled with cabinets that no one has opened in decades. Memos yellowing quietly, reports typed in fonts no longer in use, boxes stacked on boxes, each one stamped with layers of security markings. The contents may be mundane, their significance long evaporated, and yet the markings themselves carry weight. No one wants to be the one to lift the lid and risk exposure, and so the files remain, locked in silence, shadows preserved for no one's eyes. Some programs carry rituals of closure. Retirement ceremonies are held, budgets reallocated, offices reassigned. Yet the files survive. They are never destroyed outright, never spoken of in public. They slip instead into the quiet back rooms of record centers, where they join others already asleep in steel drawers. The people who once created them grow old, retire, and pass away. The knowledge remains, but it is no longer in minds. It lives only in folders that few dare to touch. This is the true architecture of shadow governance, not a cabal of men meeting in smoke-filled rooms, but the quiet accumulation of locked cabinets, sealed envelopes, and passwords that outlive their keepers. It is not always deliberate conspiracy. Often it is inertia, silence that has become comfortable, a habit easier to maintain than to undo. In that context, the Majestic 12 story feels almost inevitable. If a secret of such magnitude were ever created, why would it not persist? Once 12 men agreed to keep it, once a single file was stamped with the words "Majic Eyes Only," the gravity of classification would ensure it never escaped. Even if the committee itself dissolved, the tradition of silence would remain. Shandera, studying the photographs on his table, could not have known whether he held truth or forgery. But what he did know, what history already proved, was that governments are built to keep. Once knowledge enters the sealed corridor of classification, it rarely finds its way back into daylight. And in that silence, myth and reality mingle until no one can quite tell them apart. The desert outside his apartment had its own way of keeping secrets. Winds erased footprints, time softened wreckage, night swallowed light until only memory remained. In such a place, the habit of secrecy seemed less like a choice and more like a reflection of the land itself, patient, quiet, eternal. Chapter 6. Witnesses in the shadows. Long before the Majestic 12 papers surfaced, whispers had already circulated. They came not from journalists or authors, but from men and women who had served quietly in government programs, who spent careers inside laboratories, bases, and facilities where secrecy was a daily routine. Their voices rarely reached headlines. More often, they were shared in small interviews, in late-night conversations, or in statements released near the very end of their lives. One of the earliest came from Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer stationed at Roswell in 1947. Decades after the debris was collected, he spoke of materials that resisted explanation, thin, lightweight, unable to be bent or burned. His words were measured, tinged with the tone of a man who had lived under military discipline, yet no longer felt the need to remain entirely silent. To many, Marcel's account stood as the human bridge between rumor and possibility, the living memory of an event that official files dismissed. Others followed. Technicians at bases in New Mexico and Nevada recalled unusual shipments. Crates moved with greater caution than ordinary equipment. Some described fragments unlike conventional alloys, while others hinted at biological specimens preserved in secrecy. Always the language was cautious, wrapped in phrases like, "I can't be sure," or "this is what I saw," nothing more. And yet, the pattern was steady. Small fragments of testimony, each one too slight to confirm, but together weaving a thread of unease. Pilots, too, left their impressions. Men trained to identify aircraft with a glance reported objects in the sky that defied familiar categories. Disc-shaped craft that maneuvered sharply, silent against the roar of engines. Many never spoke publicly while in uniform, but later in retirement, they allowed themselves to hint at what they had seen. Some gave interviews to researchers, their words carrying the plain cadence of men used to reporting facts. Others spoke more softly, recalling moments of awe mixed with unease, the kind of experience that lingers not as a story, but as a weight. Perhaps the most poignant voices came from engineers and contractors who worked in classified laboratories. A few, near the end of long careers, suggested they had glimpsed projects far beyond what was officially acknowledged. They spoke of hangars sealed from view, of components that did not resemble human design, of instructions delivered with no explanation of origin. To some, these were exaggerations, shaped by memory and imagination. To others, they were the quiet proof that the extraordinary had always been present, hidden in plain sight. What united these voices was their restraint. They did not shout. They did not claim revelation. They whispered, often reluctantly, their words shaped as much by silence as by speech. In their hesitations lay a sense of burden, the weight of having carried knowledge, or at least suspicion, for decades. To dismiss them was easy. To accept them fully was difficult. Yet their testimonies, like the Majestic 12 papers themselves, refused to fade. For Shandera, alone with the documents in 1984, such testimonies provided context. He could not know whether the pages before him were authentic, but he knew that for years, men in uniform and lab coats had spoken softly of things that did not fit within the ordinary frame of government work. Their stories lingered like echoes in the desert air, drifting between truth and myth, never entirely one or the other. And so, even before researchers weighed the documents, the ground had been prepared. a pattern of whispered testimonies already existed, a chorus of quiet witnesses in the shadows. The Majestic 12 story did not create mystery, it merely joined one already unfolding. Stories passed slowly through families and waiting rooms, folded into wills, and whispered at kitchen tables. Pattern disclosure is a patient thing. Details emerge not all at once, but in pieces, through confidences shared when careers end and caution softens. In the arc of the MJ-12 debate, many of the clearest voices came late. Testimony offered near retirement, statements given when reputations were secure, or when age made risk smaller than truth. There are the deathbed confessions scholars often cite, a retired technician in a veteran's home, with a voice grown thin, confided to a nurse that he had helped unload crates, labeled in ways that made no sense. A contractor who, with a tremor of apology, told his daughter of days spent in a windowless hangar and nights that smelled of solvents and formaldehyde. Such admissions arrive brittle and fragmentary, often too late to be examined with the care of contemporaneous records, and so they enter the public record as suggestion rather than proof. Then there are sealed testimonies, affidavits lodged with sympathetic researchers, statements placed in safekeeping until a future date, recordings entrusted to lawyers to be released only should certain conditions be met. These fragments can be maddeningly tantalizing. They promise context, but they are often bound by non-disclosure or bound to be opened only when gatekeepers permit. The secrecy becomes recursive, testimony about secrecy itself, hidden until the keepers decide otherwise. Families inherit fragments, and stories shift into a different register. A son finds a bundle of yellowed memos and a string of initials in his father's desk and spends years trying to make sense of them. A daughter receives a sealed envelope with instructions, "Open only after my death." In these hands, the objects of classified work become domestic relics, their meanings refracted through memory and grief. When fragments are shared publicly, they are filtered again by grief, by pride, by the urge to make sense of a life that included unspoken work. Researchers have learned to read these patterns with both hope and caution. A single late confession may illuminate nothing. A chorus of similar accounts can become persuasive. Where one former technician whispers of strange alloys, another, decades later, will recall being instructed to remove unusual samples from a crate and watch them stored at low temperature. Where one retired pilot notes an object that outmaneuvered jets, another provides radar logs that at least corroborate an anomalous track. Piece by piece, a mosaic can form, yet the mosaic is never complete. Memory is porous, time smooths edges, people forget precise dates, conflate events, and sometimes reshape stories in ways that feel truer than the original fact. Add to this the social pressures, shame, ridicule, career risk, and the result is a record that is as much about human frailty as it is about events. Testimonies arrive wrapped in uncertainty, and uncertainty is the habitat of mystery. Still, there is an undeniable weight in accumulation. When multiple independent accounts point toward the same oddities, unusual materials, unexplained recoveries, quiet directives from on high, the aggregate becomes significant. It is not proof in the courtly sense, but it is a pattern that demands attention. It moves the question from the realm of lone anecdote into one of institutional habit. For Shandera and the researchers who followed him, these patterns mattered. The Majestic 12 pages did not stand alone. They nested within a long murmuring record of witnesses who had, over decades, offered fragments and confidences. Whether those fragments converged upon the truth the documents claimed would remain debated, but the existence of the fragments themselves, of late confessions, sealed affidavits, and inherited papers, ensured the story would not die simply because one set of pages bore inconsistencies. It would continue to be carried in the voices of those who had lived near the machines of secrecy, whispering at last into the open air. The final group of witnesses were not men with microphones before them, nor names attached to official reports. They were the quieter figures, engineers, archivists, technicians who carried fragments of memory into retirement. In the communities of New Mexico, Nevada, and the outskirts of Washington, stories surfaced in cafes and veterans' homes, passed along without recordings or transcripts, only in murmurs. One such account came from a retired radar operator who, in the late years of his life, told his grandson about objects that outpaced our screens. He described nights when blips appeared, moved faster than any intercept could track, and were quietly erased from the logbooks before morning. His grandson remembered the story not for its detail, but for the way the old man's eyes lingered on the horizon afterward, as though the sky still held unfinished business. There were whispers of engineers who claimed to have handled metals unlike anything they'd known. A machinist recalled beams that bent but did not break, foils that wrinkled only to smooth out again, inscriptions that reminded him of symbols yet did not match any alphabet. He never spoke of these in public, but family members found sketches in his workshop after he passed, drawings filed between receipts and grocery lists. Patterns repeated themselves. In retirement communities around Albuquerque, old men would gather over coffee and speak in lowered voices. Some referred to hangars in the desert that had no numbers, to warehouses where they signed forms without reading, to shipments they were told not to question. Always, there was the same undertone that their ordinary careers had brushed against something extraordinary, and that silence had been the price of steady pay and pension. The burden of the witness was rarely dramatic. It was, more often, the quiet loneliness of carrying a truth unshared. Some chose silence out of fear of ridicule, wary of becoming the neighbor whispered about at church, or the relative whose stories were dismissed as senility. Others kept quiet because oaths of secrecy had been sworn, even if the programs themselves had long since ended. For them, the word classified was less a legal term than a lifelong weight. Yet, despite this silence, fragments escaped. Letters appeared in archives, unsigned but carefully typed. Diaries surfaced with vague references to the project or the others. Researchers collected these fragments like pale shards of pottery, knowing each piece by itself revealed little, but together hinted at patterns too consistent to ignore. To those who sought the truth, the weight of testimony mattered even when proof did not follow. A dozen engineers, unknown to each other, describing metals that behaved the same way. A handful of radar men, across decades, speaking of targets that moved beyond physics. A scattering of families inheriting sketches, stories, or locked envelopes. None of it added up to certainty, but all of it added up to mystery. In the end, that was the shape of the witness's contribution, not a revelation, but an echo, a persistent suggestion that behind the official walls of secrecy, something larger than paperwork had once stirred. Whether the Majestic 12 documents were genuine or forgery, the pattern of voices around them gave them life. And in retirement homes, kitchen tables, and dusty notebooks, the whispers of those who had seen too much ensured that the mystery would not quietly fade away. Chapter 7. The Persistence of Mystery. The story of the Majestic 12 documents should have ended long ago. By the late 1980s, skeptics had cataloged the inconsistencies, pointing to signatures too neat, terminology too modern, and formatting that strayed from bureaucratic standards of the era. Investigations by archivists and document experts concluded, with calm finality, that the papers bore every sign of forgery. By rights, the controversy should have faded, consigned to the long list of elaborate hoaxes that captured attention for a moment and then slipped quietly into obscurity. And yet, the documents refused to disappear. They lingered in conversations, in late-night radio programs, in quiet corners of libraries, where photocopies were passed from hand to hand. They surfaced in documentaries, books, and symposiums, always returning like echoes that could not be silenced. The question, then, is not why the documents were debunked. The question is why they endured. Part of the answer lies in timing. The 1980s were a decade of renewed fascination with UFOs. Television carried dramatizations of Roswell. Books filled shelves with accounts of abductions, and the public appetite for mysteries beyond the ordinary was deep. Into that atmosphere, the Majestic 12 papers arrived like fuel on an already glowing fire. Even if flawed, they carried the trappings of officialdom, stamps, seals, and the unmistakable rhythm of classified language. For many, those trappings were enough to stir belief. Another part lies in the names themselves. Vannevar Bush, Roscoe Hillenkoetter, Nathan Twining. These were not invented identities. They were men of real power, their biographies verifiable, their service unquestioned. To see such names aligned on a single page, tied together under the banner of secrecy, lent the documents a plausibility that was difficult to dismiss entirely. Even skeptics acknowledged that if a committee had ever existed, these were precisely the kinds of men who would have been chosen. But perhaps the deepest reason for their persistence is not factual at all. It is emotional. The documents spoke to a longing that ran deeper than proof or disproof. They suggested that someone, somewhere, already knew the answers to questions that haunt the human imagination. Are we alone? Have we been visited? Does the government hold secrets larger than any citizen can conceive? Whether real or not, the pages offered reassurance that the unknown was not being ignored, but managed. They gave shape to mystery, and in doing so, they provided comfort. Even government denials played into the endurance. For every statement dismissing the papers, believers found confirmation. Silence to them was not absence but evidence. If the documents were meaningless, why respond at all? Why bother to investigate, to test, to publish refutations? The very act of denial became, paradoxically, fuel for belief. And so the Majestic 12 documents took on a second life, one independent of their authenticity. They became a kind of modern myth, resonant not because they were true, but because they felt true. They carried the textures of secrecy, the tone of authority, and the echo of stories already whispered for decades. Like folklore, they spread, adapted, and endured, not as proof, but as symbol. For Shandera, who first unfolded the photographs in the quiet of his apartment, the papers had begun as a tangible mystery, ink on film. For those who came after, they became something larger, an emblem of secrecy itself, a reminder that in the vast machinery of government, there are always corridors we cannot walk. Whether forged or genuine, they told a story people were ready to hear, a story about guardianship, silence, and the possibility that humanity's questions had already been answered, hidden away in locked files. The endurance of the Majestic 12 story does not rest only on the past. It has been continually renewed by events in the present, by the slow, deliberate acknowledgement that unidentified aerial phenomena remain under investigation, and that what was once dismissed as fantasy has found its way into official reports. For decades, the government line was simple. there was nothing to investigate. UFOs were the misidentifications of planets, the tricks of weather, the inventions of overactive imaginations. The message was repeated so often that it hardened into common wisdom. To question it was to risk ridicule. Yet, beginning in the 21st century, the edges of that certainty began to fray. In 2017, mainstream newspapers revealed the existence of a program known as the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, a quiet Pentagon effort that had studied unexplained aerial encounters for years. The news arrived with video evidence, cockpit footage of objects moving in ways that defied conventional explanation, captured by Navy pilots whose calm professionalism made their astonishment all the more striking. These clips, the so-called tic-tac videos, brought the subject into the public square in a way not seen since Roswell. The echoes were immediate. Analysts pointed out how the government had once again studied the unexplained in secret, only acknowledging it when documents and insiders forced the issue. To believers, it was confirmation of what the Majestic 12 papers had suggested decades earlier, that secrecy was the rule, and that official disclosure came only when denial was no longer possible. Congressional hearings followed. For the first time in generations, lawmakers asked military officers about unidentified phenomena in open session. The language had shifted, no longer flying saucers or little green men, but unidentified aerial phenomena and anomalous craft. The change in terminology was subtle, but the effect was profound. It placed the mystery within the sober lexicon of defense and intelligence, stripping away ridicule and replacing it with quiet legitimacy. For researchers who had spent years with the Majestic 12 documents, the parallels were striking. In both cases, ordinary citizens had been told nothing of consequence existed. In both cases, files later revealed that investigations had been ongoing behind the curtain. And in both cases, the public was left with the same unanswered question: if secrecy had lasted this long, what else might remain hidden still? The resilience of the MJ-12 legend lies partly in this cycle. Every modern disclosure, every cautious acknowledgement, acts like a mirror, reflecting back on the documents of 1984. Even if the papers were forged, the pattern they describe, committees, secrecy, denial, continues to play out in real time. The story does not depend on authenticity, it depends on resonance. For those who drift toward belief, the parallels provide comfort. They suggest that whispers of hidden committees were not folly, but foreshadowing. For skeptics, the parallels are instructive in another way. They remind us that secrecy itself, regardless of subject, creates myths as surely as it hides truths. Once silence is established, stories will grow in its shade. As the Pentagon releases new reports, as pilots describe encounters with calm precision, as congressional briefings acknowledge the unknown without ever naming it, the Majestic 12 documents remain present like a shadow on the wall. They may be forged ink on paper, but they continue to live in the spaces between what is said and what is withheld. While debates about authenticity circle endlessly in archives and conferences, the land itself remains unchanged. New Mexico still stretches wide beneath a canopy of stars, its desert plains unbroken, its mesas steady against the horizon. The same sky that hung over Roswell in 1947 still glitters with cold clarity. The same winds that carried dust across Albuquerque in 1984 still move softly through sage and scrub. The terrain remembers, even when paper fades. It is a curious truth. Landscapes hold memory differently than documents. Files can be shredded, signatures contested, ink declared false, but the desert offers no verdict. It simply bears silent witness. On the ranch lands near Roswell, cattle still wander over the same ground where strange fragments were once said to lie. In the mountains outside Albuquerque, the air remains as thin and quiet as it was when Jaime Shandera opened his package. The physical places tied to these stories endure as anchors, giving weight to legends that might otherwise drift away. Researchers who visit these sites describe a sense of stillness, as though the land itself has absorbed the echoes of secrecy. Standing on a ridge where recovery operations were rumored, one sees not wreckage but horizon, endless, unmarked, indifferent. Yet the imagination fills the silence. The knowledge that something once may have happened there transforms the emptiness into resonance. It is not proof, but presence. The archives, by contrast, remain more fragile. Pages can vanish, seals can be doubted, testimony can be contradicted, but the desert has no need for validation. It simply persists, a constant backdrop to the human drama of secrecy and speculation. In its vastness, one can almost sense why governments might choose such places for hidden work. Silence comes naturally here. Distance itself becomes a form of classification. For those who live nearby, the mystery lingers not in official documents, but in local memory. Stories passed in diners, in barbershops, at family gatherings, accounts of convoys moving at night, of sudden closures of land, of lights that hung silently above the desert floor. These memories do not fade with debunking. They are part of the lived texture of place, woven into the identity of towns and families. And so the Majestic 12 story, whether fact or fiction, endures not only because of papers and debates, but because of geography. The desert itself has become part of the narrative, an open archive no archivist can alter, a stage that waits quietly while generations interpret what may or may not have occurred upon it. Shandera could not have known that when he unspooled his film in 1984, he was adding to a mythology already written in the soil. Roswell, Alamogordo, Albuquerque, names that now resonate not only as locations but as symbols of secrecy, places where silence feels heavier, where the horizon itself seems to withhold. The land holds steady, the skies remain open, and in that enduring silence, the questions persist, not as proof, not as revelation, but as echoes that refuse to leave. Chapter 8. Into the classified night secrets have a peculiar gravity. Once created, they draw attention not only to what they hide, but to the act of hiding itself. A locked drawer in an office is not remarkable until it is locked. A sealed envelope is ordinary until it bears the words, "Eyes Only." Concealment transforms the mundane into the magnetic, and so it is with the Majestic 12 documents. Whether genuine or forged, they remind us that the act of classification is never neutral. It shapes imagination as much as it shields information. Governments understand this paradox well. To secure a program, they do not only restrict its details, they restrict its very existence. The words "need to know" ripple outward, ensuring that silence surrounds not just the content, but the concept itself. In such silence, myth begins to grow. What is hidden becomes larger than life, more extraordinary than it might have been if left in plain sight. The secrecy feeds the story until the story itself becomes the secret. The Majestic 12 papers illustrate this pattern perfectly. Had they been left as anonymous forgeries, forgotten in a drawer, they might have carried no weight. but because they bore the markings of classification, because they whispered of corridors beyond public reach, they entered the mythology of secrecy. Researchers studied them not as curiosities, but as portals into the shadowed architecture of government. Each stamp, each margin, each typed phrase became a clue, not just to what was said, but to what was withheld. This is the strange truth of classified worlds. The very measures meant to contain mystery often amplify it. A redacted page tells us less than a clear one, yet it lingers longer in memory. A denial breeds more speculation than a confirmation. The absence of answers becomes a presence in itself, filling the imagination with possibilities. Consider how the documents shifted their meaning over time. In 1984, they were new, startling, a sudden eruption of secrecy into the hands of a single researcher. By the 1990s, they had become contested, debated in journals, examined under magnification, weighed against the standards of historical authenticity. And now, decades later, they live less as evidence than as emblem. They are no longer just words on paper. They are symbols of what secrecy does to human thought. For those who believe, the documents confirm that hidden committees do exist, that truth is already cataloged in vaults just beyond reach. For those who doubt, the documents prove something different, but equally unsettling, that forgery alone can generate entire ecosystems of belief, that human longing for mystery can breathe life into paper even when its claims collapse under scrutiny. In either case, the power lies not in the content, but in the concealment. And perhaps that is the final lesson of secrecy, that once created, it shapes the world regardless of what it hides. A classified file need not contain revelations to change history. It need only exist. Its silence becomes a force, its lock a symbol, its presence a quiet command to wonder. The Majestic 12 papers, whether written in the corridors of power or in the quiet study of a forger, embody this truth. They are less about aliens or committees than about the weight of hidden words, about how secrecy itself becomes myth. In this way, they remind us that what is unseen is never inert. In the classified night, shadows grow longer, and silence itself becomes a story. There is a strange solace in mystery. For all the frustration that unanswered questions bring, there is also a quiet comfort in the spaces where certainty does not reach. In a world where every detail seems catalogued, measured, and explained, the unknown offers a place of rest, a reminder that not everything must be defined, not everything must be solved. The Majestic 12 story, in this sense, has given more comfort than clarity. For some, it is the reassurance that if the universe holds visitors, someone already knows that behind closed doors, perhaps there are guardians of the extraordinary, quietly ensuring stability while the rest of the world goes about its business. The idea is less about fear and more about protection, a sense that the unknown is not neglected, but watched over. For others, the comfort lies in the opposite. If the documents are a forgery, if no such committee ever existed, then the myth itself becomes the gift. It reminds us of our capacity for imagination, for weaving patterns from fragments, for finding meaning in whispers. The documents, then, are less about extraterrestrials and more about humanity's longing for wonder. They show how the need for mystery is as strong as the need for answers. There is peace in this duality. Belief and disbelief both find a kind of rest in the Majestic 12 story. One does not need to decide absolutely. One can simply linger in the uncertainty, like lying beneath a sky filled with stars too numerous to name. The absence of knowledge becomes an open space, wide enough for dreams, gentle enough to soothe. Governments often view secrecy as a shield, a way to guard against panic or intrusion. Yet for the ordinary listener, secrecy can also become a lullaby. It says there are things you need not carry. There are questions you need not answer. What lies in the vaults, what is hidden in the archives, need not trouble your sleep. Someone else bears that weight, whether real or imagined. The very shape of classified language carries this effect. The phrases are steady, unadorned, without emotion. They speak of recovery, containment, oversight. They leave out the drama, the color, the urgency. In their cold precision, they leave room for imagination to soften the edges. They do not frighten, they simply imply, and in that implication lies room for comfort. In an age of constant information, of headlines and alerts that clamor for attention, the endurance of a mystery like Majestic 12 serves another role. It reminds us that not everything can be reduced to clarity. It whispers that some corners of experience remain beyond reach, not because they are hidden, but because they are too large, too strange, too delicate for easy capture. And perhaps that is why the story has lasted as long as it has, because it allows us to rest in the uncertainty, to hold the question without the pressure of an answer. Whether one leans toward belief or doubt, the mystery itself becomes the destination. It is enough to know that such questions exist and that we are free to drift among them without conclusion. As the desert night stretches endlessly, as stars shine indifferent to human debate, the Majestic 12 documents remain in their peculiar role. They do not resolve, they do not confirm, they simply remind us that some mysteries endure, and that endurance itself is a form of comfort. Every path the Majestic 12 story takes eventually leads to the same horizon, questions too large to answer, yet too persistent to fade. They are the questions that have echoed across generations, whispered in deserts, written into archives, carried in the silence of witnesses who never quite spoke aloud. Are we alone? It is the simplest, most enduring question of all. The documents hint at an answer, cloaked in typewritten phrases and stamped with authority, yet the answer never arrives in full. It remains suspended, like a star glimpsed from the corner of the eye, visible for an instant, then gone. What do governments know? The papers suggest corridors of secrecy, committees whose names never appear on public rosters, decisions made in rooms without windows. If true, then history itself has been shaped by knowledge withheld. If false, then their existence still reveals something profound, that we are willing to believe our institutions carry more than they reveal, that secrecy itself feels inevitable. And finally, who decides? If there are truths too large for public eyes, who grants permission to the few who guard them? 12 names typed on a page imply guardianship, but also responsibility. The idea that decisions of cosmic weight might rest in the hands of a small, unelected group is unsettling, yet strangely human. For all our talk of democracy and openness, we accept that some doors will always remain locked. These questions resist closure. They are not designed to be answered in headlines or reports. They live best in reflection, in the quiet of night, when the stars hang still and the mind drifts softly between thought and dream. In that half-light, certainty is less important than wonder. The documents may be forged, they may be genuine, or they may be something else entirely. A reminder that mystery itself has value, that the unknown gives shape to imagination. As the chapter closes, the desert returns once more. The wind moves gently through the sage, carrying with it the same silence that has always lingered here. The archives remain locked, the papers unchanged, the questions unyielding, and yet, in that silence, there is peace. For mystery does not demand urgency, it asks only to be acknowledged, to be carried softly, like a story told at the edge of sleep. And so we drift into the classified night, not with answers, but with the quiet reassurance that some questions are eternal, and that in their endurance lies a strange, calming beauty. The desert at night is a place of endless quiet. The air cools, the sand releases the heat of day, and the stars emerge, countless and steady, scattered across a canvas that has looked the same for millennia. Out here, secrets feel less like concealments and more like part of the natural order, whispers folded into the stillness, questions softened by distance. As we step back from the corridors of classification, from the cabinets and typewritten pages of the Majestic 12 story, we return to that quiet landscape. The papers, whether authentic or forged, have led us through decades of speculation, analysis, and wonder. We have walked with Shandera in his Albuquerque apartment as he unfolded the film canister. We have sat with the imagined Eisenhower Briefing, felt the weight of names typed in precise alignment. We have studied margins, signatures, and the inconsistencies that both build and unravel authority. And we have listened to witnesses in the shadows, men and women who carried fragments of memory into the twilight of their lives. But now the documents return to their stillness. They rest where they began, paper and ink, fragile artifacts that carry more weight in imagination than in fact. What endures is not the certainty of their claims, but the persistence of their mystery. In that persistence, there is comfort, for human beings are not shaped by answers alone. We are shaped by questions, by the horizons we cannot cross, by the silences that remind us of our limits. The Majestic 12 story, with all its contradictions, offers such a horizon. It does not settle the question of extraterrestrial contact. It does not resolve the nature of shadow governance. Instead, it holds a space where wonder can live, where possibility rests quietly beside doubt. As you listen now, let those questions soften into the background of thought. Imagine the desert night as it stretches endlessly, the stars wheeling slowly overhead. Each one is a question in itself, each one a reminder that the cosmos is larger than any document, larger than any secrecy we might weave. Beneath those stars, humanity's search for answers feels small, but not unimportant. It feels like part of a rhythm, the rhythm of wonder. Think of the 12 names, once typed on a page, now scattered like constellations. Admirals, generals, scientists, intelligence chiefs, real men who walked the halls of power, their lives entangled with history. Whether they ever sat together in shadowed rooms or not, their names remind us that every age has its guardians of knowledge, its keepers of silence, its watchers of the unknown. And in that remembrance, there is a strange serenity. For perhaps the truest comfort is this, that the unknown has always been with us, and always will be. From the ancient sky watchers who carved stars into stone, to the modern analysts who magnify margins of classified memos, humanity has lived in the space between knowledge and mystery. That space is not empty. It is where stories are born. It is where imagination rests. It is where, at the edge of sleep, the mind finds room to wander gently, without demand for resolution. The desert wind moves softly through the sage. The night insects sing their steady chorus. In vaults and archives, files remain locked, untouched by the passage of time. In living rooms and libraries, copies of the Majestic 12 papers sit quietly in folders, their words unchanged, their meaning ever shifting. and above it all the stars shine, indifferent to debate, radiant in their silence. Allow that silence to surround you now. Let the weight of secrecy lift from your shoulders. There is no need to decide tonight what is true and what is false. There is only the comfort of mystery, the calmness of questions left unanswered, the gentle drift of thought into dream. Close your eyes to the desert horizon. Feel the coolness of the night air, the steady rhythm of your own breathing. The documents fade into shadow, the names into memory, the questions into the vastness of sky. What remains is peace, the peace of knowing that not everything must be solved, that some mysteries are best carried softly, like whispers into sleep. And so, as the stars wheel overhead, you drift with them, carried by the silence of the classified night, into rest, into calm, into dream.